Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Dr. Hope Ferdosian, an internal medicine, preventive medicine, and public health doc at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine and president and CEO of Phoenix Zones Initiative, which advances the rights, health, and well-being of people, animals, and the planet through education, research, and advocacy for policy change. Phoenix Zones Initiative is excited to host this event on transforming medical research this evening. We're joined by our co-sponsors, Cambridge University Press, the Canadian Centre for Alternatives to Animal Methods, the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus, the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at Upstate Medical University, Princeton University Press, the Society for the Study of Ethics in Animals, the University of Chicago Press, and the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. Please stay tuned for a very special message from Dr. Jane Goodall, when we will also have an opportunity to thank our media partners. Before we share more about here tonight, I'd like to give each of the panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves. Charu, can you get us started?
Hi, thank you for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Charu Chandrasekhara. I am the founder and executive director of the Canadian Centre for Alternatives to Animal Methods, located at the University of Windsor in Southern Ontario, Canada. I am a biomedical researcher with expertise in cardiovascular research and diabetes, and I am a former animal researcher. And during my time as an animal researcher, I learned firsthand the futility of animal experimentation, and I walked away from it all. And now I'm working hard to influence the Canadian animal testing landscape to promote the replacement of animals in Canadian biomedical research, education, and chemical safety testing through 21st century science, innovation, and ethics.
Hi, my name is Agustin Fuentes. I'm a biological anthropologist, a professor at Princeton University. I've worked with a number of different species of primates, including humans and other mammals, both in laboratory and field contexts. And I'm just very happy to be here to engage in this very important discussion and to help move this conversation forward towards a better planet for all of us, not just humans.
Hi, I'm Sid Johnson, and I'm a philosopher, bioethicist, and neuroethicist at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at Upstate Medical University in New York. I'm interested in brains of every kind, shape, and size, and on neuroscientific research and on embracing uncertainty. As an animal ethicist, I'm also interested in pushing bioethics and neuroethics to be less anthropocentric and in overthrowing human exceptionalism and human supremacy.
Engel,
Barbara?
for 30 years, I've been in the primate biomedical.
Hi, I'm Barbara King. I'm here in Virginia. I'm an emeritus professor of anthropology at William & Mary. I'm also a freelance science writer with a particular specialty in animal cognition and emotion. And I have observed monkeys in Kenya and done work on gesture in great apes.
Lisa. Lisa, I apologize.
That's
introduce
quite okay.
yourself.
Hi, I'm Lisa Jones Engel, and I've spent the last 30 years in primate biomedics community, first as a technician, then as a researcher and a principal investigator, and finally as a member of the University of Washington's Animal Oversight Committee. What I could no longer deny or ignore that the animal welfare failures were so completely undermining the integrity of the science, I left. And I now serve as PETA's Senior Scientific Advisor on Primate Experimentation.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jessica Pierce. I'm a bioethicist and affiliate faculty with the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at Anschutz Medical Campus in Colorado. I've been working in the field of environmental bioethics and animal ethics for my entire career, and am interested in exploring new ways to envision the moral contours of human-animal relationships. So thank you all for being here.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Wendler, and I'm a philosopher, and I'm in the Department of Bioethics at the NIH Clinical Center. And as you'll hear in a little bit, most of my work has been on the ethics of research with humans who can't give informed consent. And so my role here is thinking about the connections between those issues and the issues of ethics with research with animals.
Thank you to all of our panelists for being here tonight. It's so great to have everyone here. Tonight, you're here to talk about how we can work together to transform medical research. Fortunately, despite a painful history, human research has become far more ethical over time. But that evolution didn't happen overnight, and it only happened with public pressure. Decades of public outrage over unethical human research eventually led to the 1979 publication of the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report dramatically transformed human research for the better. The Belmont Report called for 3 key principles: respect for autonomy, that is the freedom to govern our own lives, a goal to do good and to do no harm, central tenets of medical ethics, and justice, the fair selection of research subjects. As a result, human research now requires informed consent, a full assessment of the risk and benefits of research, and perhaps most importantly, special protections for vulnerable individuals and populations, such as children who cannot provide informed consent. It also offers special protections for those who could be targeted and harmed because of their vulnerabilities in society. The situation's much different for animals. Globally, hundreds of millions of animals are used each year for research. Animals are commonly targeted because of their vulnerabilities, and they overwhelmingly bear the burdens of research despite their inability to provide informed consent or to from the research. Due to concerns about animal suffering and the validity and reliability of animal experiments, there have been many attempts to transform animal research, including efforts to target one experiment or a group of experiments at a time. But as with human research, we need a transformative paradigm shift to bring medical research into the 21st century. We need something like a Belmont Report for animals. Dr. Johnson and I wrote with colleagues about the need for a Belmont Report for animals in 2019, 40 years after the Belmont Report was published for human research. And Drs. Fuentes, Jones, Engel, and Wendler penned responses to that call. And this month, in the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics, Drs. Fuentes, Johnson, King, and Pierce and I published a paper that sets forth a path toward an anti-maleficent research agenda in line with the Belmont principles. As we wrote, that path must include a roadmap toward a more just and ethical system, federal funding shifts, changes in publication standards, and improvements in education, training, tenure, and promotion. Tonight, we aim to build on all of our individual and collective work, as well as the work of others, toward an aspirational yet concrete roadmap to transform medical research for both human and non-human beings. With that, let me please ask Dr. Chandrasekhara to get us started by sharing how she's a similar or related charge in Canada. Charu?
Thank you, Hope. Over the past century, animals have played an integral role in the life sciences, as we all know, to the point where we consider rodents to be the gold standard for humans. But there is a clear distinction between how we treat human subjects and these animals who, on one hand, are good enough to be the gold standard models of our biology, but on the other, are not worthy of gold standard treatment and welfare and protection. I mean, just look at it. The gold standard rodents are excluded from the US Animal Welfare Act, and here in Canada, we don't even have an Animal Welfare Act for the animals in science. Animals are considered property under the Criminal Code of Canada, which was written in the 1800s. So more than 60 years after the 3 Rs, we, the scientific community, we're still talking about cage enrichment, bigger and better cages with nesting materials and toys as a measure of welfare improvement. It's blatantly evident that animals are treated merely as a tool in science. A special tool, though, because most animals are considered to be the be-all, end-all hammer that everyone reaches for. But if all you use is a hammer, then everything is treated like a nail. And this is why, when it comes to human biology, physiology, pharmacology, and toxicology, animals have been and they continue to be more misleading than helpful. It's the third decade of the 21st century. We need 21st century tools to address 21st century needs. We have a lot of tools in our toolkit, perhaps none perfect as standalone, none that fits all. But if we use the whole toolkit instead of just the hammer, we can study human biology from genes to populations. We can understand our biology at the molecular level, biochemical pathways level, cellular, tissue, organism, and systems level and beyond. So what's possible? Let me give you a glimpse into these possibilities that we have with this 21st century toolkit. We can use human cells and tissues from cadavers and surgical remains. We can take a diseased heart removed during transplant surgery and bring it back to life in the lab to make it beat again. And we can infuse drugs to study cardiac physiology and cardiotoxicity. We can take just one single human cell and obtain hundreds of data points on human DNA and RNA through multi-omic studies. We're at a point where we can replace complex whole animal studies like skin sensitization using simple measurements made in human cells grown in a petri dish. Skin sensitization, that's looking at allergic reactions following contact of chemicals with the skin, which used to be measured in mice and guinea pigs. We can now do these things with 2 simple human cell-based tests. Heck, we can even look at biological reactivity in a test tube that doesn't even have cells, like in the macromolecular test method to identify chemicals that can induce serious eye damage. We can do complex, non-invasive imaging, biomonitoring, epidemiological studies to understand how environmental exposure and lifestyle factors and ethnicity and all these other factors that are unique to humans affect our disease development and drug responses throughout the entire human lifespan. We can integrate all this information using systems biology approaches, artificial intelligence, and computational modeling, where we can simulate biological scenarios that would never be possible even in animals. And we can engineer human tissue. We can create miniature organ models like organoids to recapitulate complex disease using stem cell technologies. At my research center, we're engineering human tissue through 3D tissue bioprinting. I hope you can see this. This is a microcosm of human physiology captured in a petri dish. We are seeing drug-induced liver injury in a dish here, and we're seeing insulin resistance in a dish here. And organ-on-a-chip technology, where human biology is emulated on a chip the size of a thumb drive. This technology is revolutionized in the way we do drug and chemical safety testing. It's poised to replace animals in drug and chemical safety testing within a very short period of time. The first time I held one of these things in my hand, I had tears running down my cheeks, and I still get emotional about it because think about all the animals who have suffered enormously and all the humans who have suffered waiting around for decades for safe and effective treatments. Just imagine in the not too distant future, you walk into a doctor's office, the doctor takes a teeny little biopsy off your skin and sends it off to a lab just down the street from you where they derive stem cells and differentiate these cells into every cell type in your body, and then take these cells to create miniature tissue models to recapitulate your biology in a petri dish, and then use platforms like organ-on-a-chip and computational modeling to test hundreds of drugs to find the one that's best suited for you based on your cells, your tissues, and your biology, not mouse biology. That is the future. That future is promising, and that future is within our grasp. Only if we ditch the animal models, the hammers from the Pleistocene epoch, and embrace 21st century animal-free toolkits.
Thank you, Charu. Barbara, you have a unique experience as a patient, and Charu has shared a lot about developing technology that could benefit human patients. Do you mind sharing some of your experience and how that informs your thinking on these issues?
Yes, thank you, Hope. That's just enormously exciting, Charu, to hear about the innovations that are here now and the ones that are coming in the future. And we know that's going to make life better for all of us, humans and other than human animals. And I do have thoughts about that. And I'd like to speak today as a biological anthropologist and an animal advocate, but also as a patient with a fairly complicated and long health history. And I do this because my own situation has caused me to feel heightened empathy for laboratory animals and to make me quite certain that a Belmont report is the way we need to go to recognize and act on animal vulnerabilities in the laboratory. So to tell you just a little bit about what has happened with me, 9 years ago, I was diagnosed with a very fast-moving and rare, also uterine cancer. And I went through an extensive surgery, also went through chemotherapy, and you can see here the result of that, and went through 25 sessions of external beam radiation and 3 sessions of internal radiation. And these resulted in quite a lot of side effects, some of which were acute at the time and some of which are chronic, including now neuropathy, digestive issues. I've had a pelvic fracture and so on. Some of the cascades that happened from all of this cancer treatment included, at least potentially related, but has happened to me, a deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism issue, and I could go on, but you get the idea. And emotionally, here is the heart of it for me. This was difficult, but always I was able to give consent for what happened to me, and every procedure was explained to me. Always, my family and my friends, some of whom are here tonight, helped me and surrounded me and helped me at every stage. Always, when I was done in the hospital, the chemo suite, or the radiation suite, I was able to go home to the comfort of my home. Contrast that now with what happens to animals in biomedical laboratories. None of that happens because, of course, they don't give consent. They don't have their family and their associates and their close companions around them. And of course, they cannot leave. They cannot leave their cage. They're there 24/7. So we have to ask, for what? One thing we'll hear again and again today is that most animal experimentation fails to really help human health. And I want to be very clear that my argument is not that if the statistics were better, somehow all this would be okay. It wouldn't be. What is coming together now is a view from justice and a view from science. And they both tell us that what happens to animals in laboratories is absolutely not okay. Animals are harmed at all stages. You know, often we think about the moment of invasive experimentation and focus on that in laboratories. And of course, that's important. But also how animals are bred into the laboratory, or how they're transported into the laboratory, or any number of things along the way also impact their experience very negatively. One thing I try to do is to hold in my mind laboratory animals as individuals. And this can be challenging because we don't get a lot of transparency from the biomedical community. But just to think about it, right now, as we're talking, there are over 75,000 monkeys held in United States laboratories alone. And in addition to that, there are countless, and I literally mean countless because they don't have to be counted, rats and mice. We also have cats, dogs, rabbits, ferrets, hamsters, even now cephalopods like octopus and cuttlefish. And we know from the work that many of us do in animal behavior, including my own in cognition and emotion, that each animal is an individual with a personality and a life history. But this goes missing very often. It can be challenging, as I mentioned, because we don't really see what goes on behind closed doors in the laboratory. Sometimes, though, we do. This can happen when an animal is retired from a laboratory to a good sanctuary, or when really brave animal advocates do undercover investigations and reveal to us what happens behind closed doors. And in this regard, I want to tell you about a monkey that I think about every single day, and his name is Cornelius. He is a rhesus macaque who is held at Wisconsin National Primate Research Center. Cornelius, and this picture comes from an article that I wrote explaining why all of the things that have happened to me have only heightened my empathy for animals in laboratories. So Cornelius was born in this laboratory in May of 2010, and several days later he was tattooed and he became a number. He has been used in experimentation that is quite invasive and now is used in invasive breeding. And what I mean by invasive is that he's subjected to electroejaculation. Most of his life, and think of those long years since May 2010, he's been caged alone. He was raised with peers for a short time, but mostly he's been caged alone. The records that I have been able to see, the still images and the videos that I have been able to see are due to undercover work by PETA, for which I'm very grateful. And they tell me how much has been taken from Cornelius. He would have been living in the wild in a group of related females called a matriline. And when I went and did my anthropology dissertation research in Kenya, I watched monkeys who are similar, baboons, not exactly the same, but similar, and they live in matrilines. And I saw how much they care for each other and how socially complex their lives are. And all of that was taken from Cornelius. He has documented chronic diarrhea, hair pulling, all kinds of things. And when you look into his eyes, you see that the light has gone out. It has gone out because of everything that has been taken from him without, of course, consent. And what do we do about this? Well, of course, we realize that what Chiara has just explained to us are things we must support, animal-free models in science. Another thing that I have started doing is to read very, very carefully scientific reports that involve animal research, specifically the methods. Because often, in the media, you get sort of breakthrough, supposedly, events happening that don't really, in the long run, turn out to be much of a breakthrough. But the methods are not really talked about very much. And I think of those animals as individuals, and I hold them in my mind and in my heart, and I understand what's been done to them, and I speak up about it on social media or to journal editors or to whatever is happening. And I want to give you just one example. I'm going to take this from an article that came out in Science magazine in January of 2021. There were researchers who wanted to study empathy in mice. And in a very tragic and indeed ironic approach to doing this, they injected compounds into these animals that would induce inflammation and pain, and then had others watch their cage mates to check for empathy. What a way to study empathy. The language in the report is, of course, clinical, and I just want to read you one sentence. A robust prolongation of the duration of hyperalgesia lasted more than 72 hours as opposed to the expected 4 to 24 hours. And what is hyperalgesia? It's heightened sensitivity to pain. So we know these animals suffer. And then what do? We must understand that we have to multiply and scale up again after we think about individuals and think about how millions of animals suffer in this way. And that's why I know, as an anthropologist, an animal advocate, and a patient, that supporting a Belmont report for animals is the right thing to do. The time has come, the animals are waiting, and it is what we must do. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Lisa, you have firsthand experience with primate research and animals like Cornelius. Can you share how that's informed your thinking on these issues?
Absolutely. And I want to thank you, Barbara, for really bringing up this issue of transparency. And I want to kind of start with that and then talk about a particular monkey named Dorothy. But, they say it's often the cover up rather than the violation or the crime that brings down the institution or the individual. And what goes on in the primate biomedical world is rarely visible to the public. And this is really a significant problem because too often the images that PETA, that the animal rights community, that the public see are these glossy images of, monkeys cavorting on the grass, or they're chewing on a nice bit of pumpkin, or they're cradling their incredibly vulnerable and yet adorable infant. And I can assure you that those are only the images that the primate industry wants us to see. To see the real pictures requires the undercover investigations. It requires the whistleblowers or the lawsuits, or like we had this week, accidents on a Pennsylvania highway where quite literally, a truck carrying 100 macaques just arrived from Mauritius was ripped open and those animals tumbled out onto the pavement. In late 2020, PETA filed a public records lawsuit against the University of Washington because the institution was refusing to release records to us, which we had asked for. Now, we sued because we thought that the institution was dragging their feet. We thought they were just being slow. However, what was discovered, and this was reported late last month, that the King County Superior Court in Washington, Seattle, ruled that the University of Washington has, in the Washington National Primate Center, held them liable for intentionally destroying public records of videos and photographs of controversial and very secretive monkey experiments. And in a series of shocking, under oath admissions, the former director of the Primate Center and two of the investigators, two scientists, and these scientists, they use monkeys in very highly invasive neurological procedures involving drilling holes in the skulls of the monkeys, cementing posts to them, attaching posts that keep them in retaining chairs, placing viewing chambers so that electrodes can be placed into the brains of these animals. These investigators described routinely deleting photos and videographic data that they had collected from these animals. Now, these actions not only violated the Washington State's Public Records Act, but also the investigator and the institution's responsibility for records retention, which they have as recipients of hundreds of millions of dollars of National Institutes of funding, and that funding comes from the taxpayer. The thing is that the investigators repeatedly stated that they felt compelled to, quote, to maintain these videos and these photos, only those which, and this is a quote, that best communicated our science. By destroying these images, the Primate Center appears to be trying to erase any record of the condition in which the animals in their facilities are maintained. And here's the thing you have to understand is that the National Primate Research Centers have published stacks of papers. Entire careers have been made on detailing and recording how captivity destroys and distorts the bodies, the minds, the immune systems of these primates who are kept in cages that are no bigger than your kitchen cabinets. Videography is used in these primate centers to identify triggers for abnormal behaviors. They monitor introduction between animals. They monitor the mothers who are about to give birth. They monitor these animals during the 23 plus hours a day that these animals, where no human is looking at them. They're just in a very cold room. And this is non-human primate data. Ostensibly, the most valuable of animal data, and from a source which is considered scarce. They're telling us that there aren't enough monkeys to do this research. You don't destroy these kind of data. And there's also the issue that by deleting this data, these PIs have they were effectively destroying the ability for other investigators to query these data themselves. So that future investigators would only have to rerun these experiments. That means more money, more monkeys, and more suffering. The primate labs know exactly how damaging unfiltered images of monkeys undergoing experimental procedures are, and what this would mean, how this would damage their message. I expected to receive some videos and some pictures of a rhesus macaque named Dorothy. And she was in the laboratory of Elizabeth Buffalo, and she'd been assigned to a protocol called the neurobiology of aging. Elizabeth Buffalo was one of the investigators named in the lawsuit that we filed. When I saw Dorothy, I was sitting on the university's Animal Oversight Committee. And when I saw her, she was old, she was sick, she was angry, she was depressed, she had plucked out all of her hair, she'd lost 20% of her body weight, she had a metal post attached to her head. This was a profoundly broken animal. Elizabeth Buffalo did not produce any of the pictures or videos of Dorothy, but we were actually able to reconstruct Dorothy's life by going through her written animal records. And we created an animated video describing what this animal endured. So when you have a couple of minutes, go and take a look at this. It's called Dorothy, a Mother Tortured at the Washington National Primate Research Center. It gives you Dorothy's life. If the public had actually ever seen the real videos and pictures of Dorothy's suffering, the outcry would have been monumental. The need for complete transparency in primate research, it cannot be overstated. And the lack of transparency is occurring at every single step where animals have been used. The accident that happened in Pennsylvania, we still know virtually nothing about how these animals were being transported, where they were going. CDC won't tell us where they were going. We don't know the infectious state of these animals. There are so many variables about the animals themselves that we're simply not given. Also the investigators are not given. We don't know when the animals arrive in the laboratories, we don't know whether they're coming from facilities in California or Texas or Florida or Louisiana. Different facilities bring with it different consequences for these animals. Wild-caught animals, we don't know whether they're coming from Mauritius, Cambodia, Vietnam. These are fundamental variables that truly impact the study design. They impact the welfare of the animals, and these are simply not being reported out. Barbara, as you mentioned, when you start looking at the experimental protocols, at the experimental methods, the language is quite obtuse to the general public, but the amount of information that's not being included in these studies is having a profound impact. And that's something that doesn't happen in human studies. The animal industry is getting away with actions that would not be tolerated in human studies, and we need to change that. And this is what a Belmont report for the animals will help do.
Thank you, Lisa. Dave, it's at times difficult to listen to some of the harms that Lisa and also Barbara talked about. And I'm wondering what guidance you can offer related to addressing risk for harm, given that there are a range of harms that animals experience as a result of their use in research.
Yeah, thanks, Hope. So as I mentioned, I work at the NIH, but I'm not a spokesperson for the NIH or a policymaker. I'm a philosopher. I always joke most of the people I work with don't agree with anything I say, but I've been thinking about the ethics of research with children for a long time, and I think there's some interesting comparisons to make. So when you think about animal research, there are some cases where the research is for the benefit of the animals, but in most cases, the research is being done for the benefit of others, exposing animals to risks and harms for the benefit of human beings. So I think about this in terms of what I call net risk research. And net risk research raises, I think, two fundamental ethical questions. The first one is whether or not it's ever ethical to expose individuals, particularly those who can't consent, to risks for the benefit of others. And second, if it is okay in certain conditions, what are the requirements that should be satisfied for such research to go forward? Now, there are obviously big differences between animals and across animals and between animals and human children. But it's interesting because there's a lot of debate, and there has been a lot of debate about the ethics of research with children. Some people think it's completely unethical. Other people support it in varying ways. But despite that controversy, despite the ongoing debate, there's still regulations about research with children. And I think it can provide at least some insights for how we could think about the ethics of research with animals, despite the disagreement that's obviously out there. So first, when it comes to research with children, the research has to have social value that justifies the risks. And as the risks of the research increase, the social value has to correspondingly increase. So an obvious requirement there with respect to animal research is we would need to make sure that whatever the risks or harms are to the animals, it's justified by the fact that this is a valuable study and collecting data that's going to help other people. Secondly, there's a typical view that you shouldn't enroll children in research that can be done equally well with adults. And so some people have been talking here and working on alternatives to animal research. So the general thought is you shouldn't expose an individual to harms, particularly one who can't consent, when you can do that research and collect that data in other ways. So there needs to be consideration first about whether or not there are alternatives to the research. Third is the risks, whatever they are, should be minimized to the extent possible. So you should look at ways of doing the research with less risk, less invasive procedures, less captivity, and so on. The fourth question, which I think is one of the hardest ones, is once you've made sure you have a valuable study and you've minimized the risks, you have to make sure that the level of net risks, the added risks to which the subjects are being exposed, is acceptable. So how do you do that? First thing to note is it's important to look at all the risks of the research. So when it comes to children, if they have to stay overnight in the hospital, that's a risk of the research, then that has to be included. Similarly with animals, if they're being transported from one site to another, that would be a risk of the research. So when it comes to children, regulations around the world are pretty consistent, and they allow net risk research with children when the risks are what's called minimal risk. And some regulations also allow what's called a minor increase over minimal risk. Now, when it comes to research with children, there are different ways to define what constitutes minimal risk. Some do it in terms of the risks of daily life. Others do it in terms of the risks that a scrupulous parent would allow their children to face. So I think one of the things that's critical here is we're going to need more research to think through what ways or how we might adapt one or another one of those standards to make it applicable to research with animals. Fifth, it's widely agreed when it comes to pediatric research, the research needs to be first reviewed and approved by an ethics committee. And that ethics committee should be independent of the research, and it should include people who are expert on children. They understand children, they understand what children's interests are, what children's needs and fears are. So obviously the same thing, I think, makes sense with animals. There should be people who understand not just animals in general, but the animals that are going to be put into the research. And finally, if we're going to make sure that the net risks, the harms and risks to which the subjects are exposed are acceptable, then we need to understand, and we need some understanding of what really does harm the subjects. And this is really difficult when it comes to animal research, because what harms one species, one type of animal, may be very different than what harms another type of animal. We've learned this with pediatric research. There are certain types of procedures, certain types of questions you ask adults that are fine for them, and they turn out to be very problematic for children. It's also the case that you talk to parents and they think certain things are going to be very harmful or bothersome to the children. You talk to the children, it turns out they're absolutely fine with those things. So what we need to do is not think what's problematic for us. We need to figure out what's harmful or problematic for the subjects who are going to be involved in the research. And that's obviously a challenge. So causing pain and suffering to a sentient animal is clearly a harm. Philosophers have lots of debates about whether or not it's even possible to harm non-sentient animals. And then what about issues where there isn't any clear pain or aversive experience, like a painless death or a comfortable captivity? To what extent are they harmful? I think those are really important, hard questions that we're going to need to work on to come up with an account of what counts as the real harms. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Jessica, a range of, including captivity, would you mind talking a little bit about harms associated with captivity and harms with captivity?
Yeah, the Belmont report articulated 3 foundational ethical principles: non-maleficence, or do no harm; beneficence, or do good; and fairness. And arguably the core, the principle with primacy here in the Belmont report has always been non-maleficence, and it's also been the ethical principle that has held a primacy of place within the field of biomedical ethics that is really unrivaled. And so I want to hone in a little bit on this core principle of non-maleficence and ask, how can we go deeper into a commitment to do no harm to research subjects. Dave talked about risks of research and weighing risks to animals against benefits to humans. And generally, this framework conceptualizes risks as those that occur during the course of an experiment, the risks of a surgical procedure, a genetic mutation, the infliction of an injury or an illness. But there is another kind of risk, or what might be better labeled a harm, and it's already come up, this theme, a few times in our conversation tonight. And that is experienced by nearly all animals used within biomedical research, and that is the harm of captivity. The negative effects of captivity on physical and mental integrity are well documented in a wide range of species, including humans, incidentally. Captivity leads to measurable physiological changes in the brain, including loss of neuroplasticity, chronic activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, permanent changes in brain morphology. It can also lead to changes in immune function, reproductive behavior, and of course, to psychological trauma. These and other captivity effects influence the quality and reliability of data collected during research in ways that we don't yet fully understand. Welfarist frameworks, including the familiar formulations of the so-called 5 freedoms and the 3 Rs, are ultimately unsatisfying because they don't attend to the principle of do no harm. Indeed, these frameworks may do more harm than good because they narrow the focus of attention onto ameliorating the suffering caused within captivity without challenging the narrative of captivity itself. Welfarism implies that we've done our ethical due diligence if we've given some attention to reducing the number of animals in an experimental protocol, or to reducing the experience of pain or suffering caused by invasive procedures. We've gone above and beyond if we pay attention to better lighting, bigger cages, more appropriate social groupings, and behavioral enrichments to combat boredom. But this still falls woefully short. Like us, other animals need food, water, air, and sleep. They need shelter and safety from physical and psychological threats. And like us, they have higher order needs, such as the need to exercise control over their own lives, make choices, do meaningful work, form relationships, and engage in play and creativity. Some measure of freedom is fundamental to satisfying these higher order needs and provides a necessary substrate for flourishing. Rather than focusing on incremental improvements to welfare within captivity, why not focus on freedom itself and not the so-called 5 freedoms, which really aren't about freedom at all, but real freedom? Although egregious research involving severe, prolonged physical and psychological suffering tends to garner the most attention, we also need to attend to seemingly benign research, which still harms animals by imposing the condition of captivity. Our societal conversation about animal research can become more ethically rigorous and aspirational by acknowledging that captivity is a harm, by acknowledging that animals want and need freedom to live their own lives on their own terms, and that moving away from the use of animals in research is the best way to move forward toward do no harm. Thank you.
Augustine, we've been talking about benefits and risks of research. What can you share about weighing benefits and risks based on your own expertise and experience?
Thanks. Yeah. To sort of continue our discussions here, I want to just sort of clarify and reemphasize what I've said and what many of us have said, that many of us, including myself, have worked in laboratory and field contexts with other organisms for broader benefits in many cases, but also actually doing work that caused explicit suffering and substantial harm to others. So that my comments here are coming from 3 decades of work in this area, where I have been complicit in the maleficence that we're referring to. But I think we recognize that a lot of the work, the research that we're talking about on other organisms has benefited humans in some ways. But increasingly, when we look at the science, when we look at the outcomes, the results, the benefits are less evident and the compensation is losing its value. So substantial research over the past decades demonstrates unmistakably that many of these benefits touted to emerge from the harm to other animals are neither as large nor as consistent or as effective as previously thought. And this is peer-reviewed data that is out there for people to see. There's considerable evidence that the conditions, as Jessica talked about and as everyone else has mentioned, the conditions of captivity, the treatment in research context, and the life experiences, right? Cornelius and Dorothy, for example, alter the bodies and minds of those individuals, and that restructures their behavior and their physiologies, which challenges the very science that we're extracting from them to understand a particular chemical, a particular disorder, a particular behavior, a particular impact. So the very baseline of the bottom line, the basal assumption of the science, is that we have a valid subject from which to ask the kinds of questions and do the kind of research we're doing. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the context of captivity, the context of manipulation in these systems of research are creating organisms that we've reshaped via substantial psychological and bodily harm. And they don't reflect the models that we assume they do. And so I think that's one major scientific crisis. Now, I'm not under the sort of illusion that all humans are going to agree on some basic intrinsic value for other organisms. I don't think that's going to happen. So that's not the pitch I want to make. But I do think that a serious and substantive assessment of the data that I've just referred to within our current understanding of other animals' sensory, cognitive, physiological, and social capacities and their processes, that has to be central to our entire research endeavor. As David talked about, and as everyone has mentioned, this is not just a moral and ethical context. This is both a philosophically, methodological, and theoretical context, and a very practical context in what data are we extracting through the substantive harm and damage to others. Now, as a scientist, I'm not going to deny the benefits humans have accrued from harming other animals. But equally, as a scientist, I cannot negate the reality that the benefits from harming others are diminishing, and that much of the research on other animals is fraught with serious methodological and practical problems. And as Lisa mentioned, if this was transparent, if we saw all of the methods and all of these examples, much of this would not pass peer review. Because of that, as a human, I empathize with many other animals. As a scientist, I recognize the complexities, and I realize that my own stance on the use of other animals in research is complicated and deeply emotional, and it's influenced by a multitude of variables, as it is for all of us. But this is exactly why we need a Belmont report for animals. We need a serious and global reassessment of how, why, and whether we harm other animals, how we do that, why we do that, what those justifications are. We need a better roadmap for navigating those landscapes, and we need to constantly highlight the data and the structures and the outcomes, not obfuscate them, not worry about clouding or complexifying the picture, but actually understand the complexity, understand the harm, and lean into the science that shows us that we are in a position where, just like with the Belmont Report for Humans, there is moral, ethical, scientific, methodological, and theoretical justification to redo the way in which we think about, enable, fund, and reward research.
Thank you, Augustine. I would just say, for those who are listening, if you're interested in learning more about some of what the panelists are talking about, a lot of what we're talking about is covered in some of the papers that I mentioned earlier on, and we'll post links to those on wherever you're viewing this, wherever you're streaming. But since we're talking about weighing risk and benefits of research, it's worth pointing out, or maybe even reiterating, that when physicians and scientists have examined how animal experimentation translates to human outcomes, they found serious problems. Problems with methodology, with clinical relevance, with predictive value, and with reproducibility of results, even in the same species, to be quite frank. Physicians, this may be common sense for many of you, but physicians don't rely on animal experiments to make daily clinical decisions. Before a medication or a vaccine can be used, it has to pass through at least 3 phases of voluntary human studies that follow the principles in the Belmont Report, to test safety, efficacy, and effectiveness. And even when new therapeutics actually make it to the market, many physicians are careful about their use as more and more data emerges post-market. And often we rely on higher levels of medical evidence to make clinical decisions, such as meta-analyses, which provide a summary of the best and most relevant evidence available, randomized controlled trials, and prospective cohort studies, such as those that look at the long-term impacts of various interventions, or even risk factors like smoking or diet or the like. And doctors in veterinary medicine, when I talk with them, have also been trying to move toward a similar high standard of clinical evidence to guide their care for the patients they care for in a clinical setting. So we currently have this unjust and less than helpful dichotomy. We're exposing animals who can't and wouldn't consent to severe and guaranteed harm. And that exceeds the minimal risk threshold that Dave talked about earlier. Furthermore, it's entirely possible that we would be further along in discovery and innovation without an 80-year-old mandated reliance on animal experimentation. Fortunately, there is legislation in Congress that would address this problem, including the FDA Modernization Act, which would allow drug companies to use modern non-animal studies, and the Humane Research and Testing Act, which would establish an NIH Center for Alternatives to Animals in Research and Testing. And you can find out more about both of those bills at transformmedicalresearch.org. We'll share that link later as well. Finally, as an internist and a preventive medicine and a public health doc, I'd be remiss not to mention the bigger picture. So not only is there a problematic reliance on animal experimentation that's really an industry, as a nation and as a society, we fail massively to invest in research to fuel prevention. We can see that every day as the healthcare system becomes more and more strained by preventable diseases. Although the US spends more on healthcare and research than any other industrialized nation, those high levels of spending don't actually translate into meaningful health outcomes, including increased life expectancy. Life expectancy actually has been going down in the US. And over the past 20 years, the percentage of deaths linked to preventable causes has remained about the same, or maybe even worsened. So if we want to meet the needs of humans and other animals, we need a research agenda that is visionary and aspirational, ethical and just, as we have with the Belmont Report and for human research. It needs to be tied to a public health agenda, including a strong emphasis on prevention. And it needs to be tied to concrete action, including radical transparency, which has been mentioned a number of times tonight, bold shifts in funding, absolutely critical to any kind of systemic change, and a coordinated roadmap across public and academic institutions and industry toward the replacement of an unjust and frankly archaic system with ethical, patient-centered methods that meet the standards set by the Belmont Report. Charu, perhaps you can speak more about how we could do better in terms of research investments?
Well, there's a lot to be said about that, but let me share some of my main thoughts here. So there's a lot to do to change this animal-centered culture of science. We have a scientific culture ingrained in animal research, a culture obsessed with curing disease in animals, a culture that disregards the colossal limitations of animal models, a culture that insists human data be validated in animal models. In essence, we have a scientific culture that ignores human biology. So changing these deep-rooted practices will require a multi-pronged approach, a combined top-down and a bottom-up approach involving major scientific, technological, financial, and legislative changes. So a roadmap to success will involve changes at many levels, changes involving all stakeholders across our societies, our academics, industry, regulatory agencies, funding bodies, science journals, bioethicists, animal rights organizations, politicians, and of course the general public. After all, it's return on investment for their tax dollars. So with a top-down approach, here are some of my thoughts. We need to hold our governments, our funding agencies, and scientific journals responsible. Change grant review and journal publication processes where human data, human-based data receive priority, where you are not asked to prove your human data in an animal model. And this is a problem that we all too often face. The last grant that I submitted based on my 3D bioprinted human lung tissue model, the peer review comments came back saying it's creative, innovative, timely, blah, 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 all of these things, all these positive things about it. But they also said that you must validate data from your in vitro model in an animal model, and a 5-year grant cannot be justified without an animal model. We need to incentivize and reward human-based research instead of, saying all of that. We need to establish large pots of dedicated funding for the development and validation of new approach methods, and at the same time, take funding away from these legacy animal studies that have been ongoing for the last 20 years that haven't yielded anything useful for humankind. And we need to facilitate widespread adoption of novel technologies, facilitate access to human research resources. It's difficult to get access to human tissues, for example, and other biomaterials. So we need to build structure, and we need to promote multidisciplinary teamwork and evaluate research success by human relevance, not by journal impact factor, because science is evaluated completely based on factors that have no bearing on advancing human health and medicine. We need regulatory agencies to incorporate data from animal-free methods into their risk assessment pipelines. And of course, we need to change these archaic laws and policies and regulations and bring in new national legislations and roadmaps to phase out animal testing. And with a bottom-up approach, this is where individual researchers can actually take responsibility to prioritize human biology-based research in their own research programs. So to the young investigators out there, you don't have to rely on animal models because that's how it's always been done. You can change that mindset, think outside the cage, and embrace new approach methods and challenge grant reviewers and journals to accept human data as superior to animal data. And for industry out there, work with regulatory agencies and push them to accept new approach methods for risk assessment. And the public, of course, has a big role to play. You can donate your research. You can donate your, money to research centers and other foundations focused on animal-free research, and you can question where your money is going when you donate to your favorite health charity. You must ensure that it's all going to human-based research, not animal research. Recently, just a couple of months ago, I gave a talk somewhere, and they wanted to donate an honorarium in my name to this cancer research foundation. And I said, absolutely not. I do not want you to do that because 95% of the work that they do over there is on animal models. So instead, I had them direct that money to the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. So there are things that you could do on an individual basis, and you should, the public, as consumers, we must always resort to only products not tested on animals. Together, we have an unprecedented opportunity to change the course of history, to make our species the quintessential animal model and our biology the gold standards. And we must uphold the highest ethical standards. We should never forget that animals are living, breathing, pain-feeling, sentient beings who, if they have the choice, would never consent to experimentation. And this is something that I personally learned from my interactions with my precious cat, Mowgli, who played a tremendous role in my life, turning me into an ethical vegan and helping me walk away from animal-based research. And we must also remember those who, everyone, all the humans who do not have safe and effective treatments. Every grandmother who died of Alzheimer's, every grandfather who suffered a stroke, every person living with heart failure, muscular dystrophy, ALS, and cancer, and so many other diseases prevalent in our society today, diseases for which we do not have effective treatments, let alone cures. For most of these diseases, there are no cures around the corner, and there won't be unless we transition quickly to a human biology-based culture of science. And for me, this was one of the most pivotal moments in my life when my father suffered a heart attack and he received quadruple bypass surgery. I was sitting at his bedside at the Dalhousie Faculty of Medicine at this hospital in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I was looking at him and all the other patients in this ward. And I wondered what I was doing in that mouse heart failure research lab, if my research that I was doing on all these mouse models would ever help people like my father and all these other human beings, because that's why I went into science. And I realized very quickly, and by that time I had already realized that research was not going to do anything for the humans that I really wanted to help. And I was harming animals at the same time. And I walked away from all of this soon after. So we need a transformation at every level, from the top, from the bottom, from every aspect in our society, because it's time. This is the third decade of the 21st century. We cannot keep resorting to Pleistocene epoch science. These animal-free technologies could put an end to enormous suffering, both animal and human.
Thank you, Charo. Sid, can you talk a bit more about a potential way forward as we start to think about how we take these ideas and transform them into concrete action?
Sure. Thank you, Hope. So the history of using animals as substitutes for humans in experimentation and scientific discovery goes back thousands of years. And it has always been recognized that animals are an imperfect substitute for humans. They're not physiologically or anatomically identical. And 4 centuries ago, Francis Bacon recognized that there were ethical concerns about dissecting humans and said at that time that non-human animals were a dissimilar but sufficient substitute. And we've hardly advanced from what he said at the time 400 years ago. Scientific knowledge has progressed today to the point that the use of non-human animals is recognized to be a source of knowledge, but also a source of significant error in the production of human relevant medical knowledge and understanding. The mid-20th century brought a lot of change for human research subjects, as Hope discussed, in the form of increased protections, especially for the most vulnerable, for those who were accessible and available, and who had no one to advocate for their well-being and protection. The Belmont Report was one example. It responded to these grave injustices in the use and exploitation of vulnerable humans, of children and disabled persons and persons who are incarcerated and institutionalized, the elderly and the dependent. And it recognized that their use was unjust when it was not informed by scientific necessity, but rather by convenience and the ease with which such unprotected and vulnerable persons could be coerced and exploited. And it defined justice in biomedical research in terms of scientific justification, on demonstrable scientific need in biomedical research rather than on convenience or ease or availability. And moreover, even if the use of those vulnerable subjects might have had positive benefits for others, their use couldn't be justified on that basis alone. What Belmont effectively said was that the prevailing attitudes of supremacy and superiority that put some powerless humans on a lower rung, persons of color, disabled persons, children, and allowed those persons to be subjugated and exploited for research were unjust. It's clear from what we've seen today that the scientific picture is very mixed on the use of animals in research. Viewed as a matter of justice, where we define that as the fair selection of research subjects based on demonstrable scientific need, it should be clear that the use of animals, even if it might sometimes be beneficial for humans, is unjust. They're used not because of their scientific suitability and not because they're the best substitutes for humans, but because they're easy to use, because they can be bought and imprisoned and forced to comply, because they cannot refuse. And the animal research enterprise is well established, and a lot of people have an interest in it continuing. But a commitment to justice requires that we apply the principles that guide human subjects research to non-humans that we use instead of humans, that we harmonize the research guidelines that exist for humans and for non-human animals, and apply the same scientific rigor, the same commitment to reducing and preventing harm, the same standard of necessity. But it also requires that we abandon human supremacy and the human exceptionalism that currently informs our attitudes about the use of animals, and about placing human desires and needs and speculative benefits above the well-being and the rights of non-human animals. It requires that we acknowledge and elevate non-humans from the lower rungs of moral considerability to which they have been assigned to their rightful place. And a principled commitment to respect requires that we acknowledge the value of autonomy and freedom and self-determination for other animals. A principled commitment to beneficence requires that we strive not just to benefit humans in biomedical research, but to protect those who are used in research. This was the major revelation of 20th century research ethics. Concern should not be limited to those to whom research might help, but also to those whom research might harm. And a principled commitment to non-maleficence requires that we recognize the real harms to non-human animals, not as a sentimental problem for objective, scientifically minded humans to overcome, but as a moral problem and a moral failing on our part, and one we should attack with the same primary commitment to morality that informed the radical reform of human research in the mid-20th century. Only a belief in human superiority and exceptionalism can justify ignoring the significant harms that research on non-human animals does. So we face a dilemma. There are scientifically, ethically, and socially important problems, and it's necessary to study those problems through biomedical research, but it's ethically unacceptable to use non-human animals to study those problems. This same problem occurs in research with human subjects. Humans are the ideal human relevant research subjects, but there are study methods that are not permitted with human subjects, like confining your subjects or killing them to study their brains or causing permanent and severe harms. We tried to solve that problem by substituting non-human animals for humans, prompted by path-breaking documents like the Belmont Report. And the time has come for us to fundamentally break that path again and find a better, ethically and scientifically sound solution.
Thank you, Sid. So beautifully said. Barbara, did you have something you'd like to add?
Yes, Sid, I think it's really brilliant to frame those remarks around human exceptionalism. That's an extremely critical concept. And I would like to just contrast it to human uniqueness. Because as an anthropologist and someone, of course, who's, reads and lives and breathes evolutionary theory, we know that humans are unique, and that this means that we do have some capabilities that other species don't. But of course, the same could be said of any other species by definition, that many species have capabilities that humans don't. And what's different about human exceptionalism is the belief that we're somehow better, superior. And of course, if we look at animals, if we really just open our eyes and get away from a human standard and look at how other animals express their intelligence and express their emotionality, we see it. One reason why I particularly love learning about and observing invertebrates is because they invite us to get out of that box of the human standard, right? You read all the science all the time that asks orcas and elephants and chimpanzees, can they do things that humans can do? But we can also just look at other animals who do things a completely different way and see that they're intelligent and that they're emotional. And I think of how spiders think with their webs, and how octopuses, they think with their arms, right? They have distributed cognition, so they have neurons all over their 8 arms. And when we look at these animals, we can see that the world is full of intelligence and the world is full of emotion. So, I love it when astronomers ask, is there intelligent life in the universe? But we know the answer to that, and it's all around us. So I want to give one quick example of human exceptionalism. There's so many, but for very many years, scientists insisted that other animals don't dream. And of course, anyone who lives with a dog or a cat, and spends like an hour with a sleeping animal knows that that's not so. We see their eyes moving, we see that their whiskers are twitching, their paws may be running. We know animals dream. But what's really exciting about the research going on now is that we're beginning to find out a little bit about what some animals may be dreaming about. And I recently had the chance to read a forthcoming book by a researcher named Dr. David Pina Guzman. This is called When Animals Dream. And if we take the example of rats, if you compare the brain activity that goes on when they're doing something in their everyday life to the brain activity when they next sleep, you can get an idea through repetitive brain patterns that they may be dreaming about what they just did. And some of this is really cool and exciting, but some of it's pretty upsetting. There was a study done, this is not he's reviewing material, where a group of rats was unfortunately given shocks to the feet at certain intervals. And I'm sorry to put this image in your head, but they, of course, were jumping and they were shrieking and they were defecating. They were suffering. And the researchers had cage mates of these animals watch. Again, that seems to be something that researchers are very into. But then they watched when the animals who were suffering so much next went to sleep. And what was so interesting is that at a certain point in their sleep, they actually startled awake in what was very clearly a panic mode. And the brain activity that had been measured just before they startled awake was indicative of dreams. And the researchers clearly recognized that these were retrieved memories that led to nightmares. And this is what trauma does. So I have started to think not only about the waking hours of all these animals held in laboratories, but I've started to think also about the sleeping hours of what's going on. I wonder if Cornelius and Dorothy dream and what they dream. And I know that working together, we can end their nightmares. And I just want to say that human exceptionalism is a hard thing to get out of. I know that I fall prey to it at times myself. It's not as if all of us here can get out of it. But think of the language that we use sometimes. Think about even in animal agriculture, which is not our topic tonight, humane slaughter. Think of the idea of painless death or comfortable captivity. If we don't use those terms for ourselves, but we're willing to use them for other animals, what does that tell us? Is there such a thing as humane slaughter? Is there such a thing as painless death? Is there such a thing as comfortable captivity in the biomedical community? I think we need to talk about those questions.
Thank you, Barbara. Augustine, we've been talking about the history of human research here and there. And of course, human research still isn't perfect, the ethics of human research. And you study and write about and lecture about issues like racism and bias. What do you have to share on that front, in terms of what we could be doing better in human research?
So I think this is very important because what we're talking about here is this broader notion of social justice, of ethical and moral engagement for living organisms. And I think what Barbara just said about human exceptionalism is very important because we need to really think about what is it that we're talking about. So here we're clearly identifying the problems with animal research, the assumptions and the outcomes. And we're also saying, look, human research is a solution. We can move so much more in there, as Charu pointed out and all of us have emphasized. But at the same time, we can't remember that this social justice issue does not disappear in human research. The Belmont report did not fix it. It improved it in the context. And so what we really need to think about is the history and the contemporary realities of racism, sexism, the global north-south divide in the context of biomedical research, in the context of public health, in the context of economic equity and political power that is currently out there. And so what I like to think is when we're talking about not the rights of animals, but the responsibilities of humans as collaborators, as parts of broad ecosystems and relations that are multi-species, we need to think about ourselves as well. So I think in thinking with how we could restructure the priorities, the protocols, the funding, the assessment of research with and on other animals, we also connect that to the movements for social justice in the engagement with humans and apply as strict criteria to our thinking about what we do with humans, with biobanks, right? With test trials, with engagement, and as Hope, as you pointed out, with public health. We know how to do preventative work and health in many ways for humans and actually for a lot of other organisms, a lot of conservation and sustainable engagement, the drawing now on indigenous sustainability, possibilities and contexts. We have a better grasp on a broad human and other animal engagement. And I think it's just important that we keep that in our minds and don't detach our concern for other animals from our concern for humans.
What are some other ways forward based on what we've been talking about tonight? Are there other ideas that we need to consider? Dave, any lessons from human research or any ways to think about, what we need to be doing better in human research that would offer lessons for how we think about the use of animals in research?
Well, one of the things that so 2 points that I think are critical that you get if you think about human research. One is, I think when it comes to human research, we've done a good job of really emphasizing the importance of the social value, that the research you're doing has to be valid, it has to be important. We like to say that if there's no value in the research, then it's unethical research, no matter how low the risks are, no matter what else is true about it. And so I think we have to take seriously of just thinking about and making sure that the research is being conducted is valuable. And the second thing, and I think we're good about this when it comes to children, we permit some research with children, but we first ask whether or not we need to enroll children. So for instance, can we do the research with adults instead? And so I think the same as a thought experiment we need to get better at when it comes to research with animals, thinking about the kinds of alternatives that people have been discussing and whether or not they're realistic alternatives, or even just doing the research with human beings or competent adults rather than animals. So thinking both about the social value and about what might be reasonable or better alternatives, I think is really important.
I think another really, to expand on that, an important point is that to some extent, we have turned to using animals as a supposedly ethical solution to the problem of using humans in research. And in some sense, the ethics led, as deficient as the ethics are, the ethics led before the science. And we are doing experiments that have no scientific justification, but we can do them because we're doing them in animals. And I think that's a fundamental problem and something that really needs to be flipped. We have to lead with the scientific justification, because research that can't be scientifically justified cannot be ethically justified, whether we're doing it in humans or in animals.
We have a couple of minutes for questions for those of you in the audience, if you'd like to pose some questions. And I did see a question pop up here about the composition of IACUCs and similar committees in Canada. And so if one or more of you can respond to the composition of animal use committees and how they might differ from IRBs, that would be helpful, I think, to those who are listening.
I'd like to pop in on that one then. This actually just came up. So right before joining this panel, I was observing the University of Washington's IACUC committee. And again, I served on that committee for 2 years. And yes, in the US, there's a requirement of members and also unaffiliated members. That requirement has been so distorted amongst the IACUC, not just at the University of Washington, but across the states, with the idea that here at UW, they actually have a pro-animal user who serves as the community member on there, with the idea that somehow that they would represent the community's ideas of what animal use should be like. But I think the biggest thing that I've seen across the IACUCs, as I did a survey, was that the lack of seating ethicists on it. And when I approached my own institutional official and said, and my own IACUC, and said, we need to have ethicists. None of us here, as a biological anthropologist, I'm not trained in ethics, neither are the veterinarians, neither are the virologists. The response was, no, we don't need to have ethicists sitting out here. Veterinarians know how to take care of animals. They're the ones providing the ethical training. The pushback that we were getting from having any of these types of conversations was astonishing. And as I've listened to us this evening, I'm thinking, one of the best things that we could do is to have these, to play these conversations to all the IACUCs across the country so that they can actually start thinking about these, because these are not bad people who sit on these committees, but they are uninformed people. And that's been a huge problem for the animals and for the science.
I would jump in really briefly just to say that I was an ethicist on an IACUC committee. It was one of the worst experiences of my life. I should have cued in. I was young at the time, early in my career. The head of the IACUC told me the purpose of this committee is to facilitate research. And that didn't quite settle in with me until I had spent 2 years on this committee, getting depression and anxiety and ulcers and you name it. Really, there was no place for ethics conversation in that setting. And I don't think it's the right forum. And my sense is that having ethicists on those committees would actually make things worse, because it gives this imprimatur of, we're taking things into consideration, and that is not the purpose of those committees. Maybe things have changed.
No, the things haven't changed. You and I could swap ulcer stories and after serving on an IACUC. But I guess I'm not convinced that it's a lack of information for the individuals who do serve on the IACUC, that there is having this out there, having them exposed to ethics training, I think is a critical component of it. And yes, I got the same comments. If we put an ethicist on here or a philosopher on this, you're going to slow down the process of getting these protocols rubber stamped. But there has to be some medium.
I think, sorry to interrupt, but I mean, this is exactly where we have in the social sciences and historical and philosophical analyses, we know that committees are stacked to achieve certain biased means. And what we need to do is restructure via, say, a Belmont report for animals, the very structuring, the very conceptualization of these committees. We need to rethink how we do this. We know that the history of science is filled with clusters of biased, racist, sexist individuals that just deployed particular perspectives to meet certain ends. But restructuring that and organizing different requirements enables us, I think, to move forward in ways that are very powerful. And a Belmont report for animals could be a first step in that direction.
I think we have lost Hope, who is our host. And she asked me to step in if she lost her connection. And here we are, we're virtually at the end of our event here. But I know that we also do have a video to show you from Dr. Jane Goodall. And so on behalf of Phoenix Zones and the Phoenix Zones Initiative, I want to thank all of our panelists, our co-sponsors, our media partners, and all of you who have joined us for this important event. And I hope that you found it as informative and as inspiring as I did. If you want to learn more about the efforts to transform medical research through concrete policy objectives that align with the principles in the Belmont Report, then please visit transformmedicalresearch.org, where you can also sign up to get regular updates. And finally, please stay tuned for a message from Dr. Jane Goodall, who is the founder of the Jane Goodall Institute and a UN Messenger of Peace.
Hello, this is Jane Goodall. In 1962, after I'd been studying chimpanzees in Gombe National Park, Tanzania, for about a year and a half, I was admitted to Cambridge University to work for a PhD in ethology. I hadn't been to college, and so had begun my study with no scientific training, just a lifelong love of animals and desire to learn about their behavior. I was understandably nervous. Can you imagine my dismay when many of the professors told me I'd done everything wrong? I shouldn't have given the chimpanzees names. They should have had numbers that were scientific. I couldn't talk about them having personalities, minds capable of problem solving, and certainly not emotions. Those were unique to humans. I was guilty of the great sin of anthropomorphism. I was actually told that the difference between us and all other animals was one of kind, and that I shouldn't have empathy for my subjects, as this would prevent the collection of cold, objective fact. Fortunately, I had a wonderful teacher when I was a child, who had taught me that in this respect, these learned professors were wrong. And that was my dog, Rusty. I also had a whole variety of animal pets, and you can't share your life in a meaningful way with a dog, cat, horse, bird, or anything, and not know that we are not the only beings with personalities, minds, and certainly emotions, such as joy, sadness, curiosity, anxiety, anger, fear, and so on. And of course they all feel pain. Fortunately, my supervisor at Cambridge was one of the foremost ethologists at the time, Professor Robert Hind. Initially, he was my sternest critic, but he changed his mind after visiting me in Gombe. And the National Geographic sent a filmmaker to document my observations so they could be shared with the world. Today, students can study animal emotions and personality. And these studies, along with all we now know about animal intelligence, have revealed just how foolish was the early scientific reductionist attitude. One of my early battles was with the way chimpanzees were treated in some captive situations, especially medical and pharmaceutical research labs. Our closest living relatives, highly social, with a lifespan of more than 60 years, kept in isolation in 5-foot by 5-foot cages surrounded by bars. That effort to change this situation in the United States culminated about 5 years ago when Dr. Francis Collins, head of NIH, decreed that all 400 or so chimpanzees in experiments funded by NIH should be released into sanctuaries. It was interesting that this decision was made not only on ethical grounds, but because a team of NIH scientists, after 18 months investigating the different experiments ongoing, found that not one benefited human health, not one was even potentially beneficial to human health. To my knowledge today, no chimpanzees anywhere are used in invasive research. A great deal of experimentation ongoing today on a whole variety of animals, thousands of them from primates to mice, subjects them to horrendous cruelty. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the introduction of the 3 R's, aimed at promoting the replacement of animal use in science, the reduction of the number of animals used, and the refinement of experimental procedures to minimize suffering and improve welfare. These principles were first described in 1959 by 2 UK scientists. That's about the time when I began my chimp research. This, of course, was a welcome step forward because at least it showed that the suffering endured by animals in research was recognized and needed to be addressed. Since that time, more countries have introduced regulations regarding the welfare of animals used in scientific research and pharmaceutical research. But only too often enforcement is lax, and again whistleblowers and videos obtained undercover reveal horrendous abuse. I must admit that watching this footage often reduces me to tears. Monkeys are often captured from the wild, seized from their families, and sent on long journeys to lives of deprivation, fear, and pain, and solitude. And hundreds and thousands more have been used in research into vaccines and cures for the current pandemic. And this is ongoing. And there is this. Sometimes cures that didn't work on animals were subsequently shown to be effective for humans. At the start of the AIDS epidemic, hundreds of chimpanzees, our closest relatives, with whom we share some 98.6 or so of our DNA, were used in the race to develop a vaccine. But though they could be infected with HIV, they didn't show the same symptoms as we did. And I remember Bob Gallo, one of the 2 who discovered a vaccine, along with Luc Montagnier, saying at one of his big AIDS conferences, "I am boxed in by the inappropriate results from chimpanzees," and yet he was the one who wanted them to start with. Today, the most promising developments are a wide range of non-animal alternatives, such as working with cell cultures and computer modeling of tissues and organs. It's clearly more rational to work with human-based material than that based on non-human animals. It'll be very much cheaper as well as more reliable. Vivodyne, the one company I have spoken with quite often, promises to be very successful and save a great deal of animal and human suffering. Of course, it'll be necessary to change laws that presently mandate a new drug or vaccine must be tested on animals before it can be released for use by humans. And of course, the animal research industry is a very lucrative business for many of the people involved, whether it be the commercial value to makers of cages and animal food and so on, or a means of procuring funding in the shape of grants by researchers. Nevertheless, for both scientific and ethical considerations, the time has come to replace the use of animals in pharmaceutical and medical research and testing as quickly as possible.
Just a quick reminder that this session has been recorded and it will be available at transformmedicalresearch.org once it has been captioned. And if you registered for this event, you will receive a notification when that is ready for you to view again. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight and thank my colleagues and co-panelists here and Hope Ferdosian and the Phoenix Zones Initiative for organizing this fantastic event. Unfortunately, Hope is having trouble reconnecting with us here, so she can't be here to say thank you to all of you who attended, and I hope everyone has a good night. Bye.